a cast-iron skillet balanced on two flat rocks beside a copper still somewhere in the hollers of West Virginia, and inside it, a slab of fatback was already popping in its own grease. That was breakfast for the men who ran illegal whiskey through the Appalachian Mountains during Prohibition and for decades before and after it. They cooked over open fires and coal beds, miles from any road, using whatever the mountain gave them. Number 14 on this list took 3 days to build and never touched an oven. Number 7 could not even be made until the first hard frost hit the ridgeline. And number 1 was the one meal every moonshiner shared, but nobody ever bothered to write down. Most of these dishes have all but disappeared from American tables. Hit that subscribe button, because what these men cooked while hiding from the law will change how you think about mountain food forever. Here are 25 forgotten meals Appalachian moonshiners actually cooked in hiding. Number 25. Ash cake. Before there were ovens, before there were even proper hearths at a still site, there was fire and cornmeal. A moonshiner mixed coarse ground corn with water and a pinch of salt, shaped it into a flat round, wrapped it in dampened cabbage leaves or corn husks, and buried it directly in the hot ashes of the cooking fire. It baked slowly from all sides. When it came out, the outside was charred and dusted with gray ash, and the inside was dense, steaming and faintly sweet from the corn itself. There was no yeast, no milk, no eggs. The ash gave it a faint mineral taste that nobody who grew up eating it ever forgot. It was the oldest bread in the mountains, and at a still site, it was often the only bread there was. Number 24. Poke salad. Every spring, a bright green weed called pokeweed pushed up through the forest floor across Appalachia. Moonshiners picked the youngest leaves before the stems turned purple, because once the plant matured, it was poisonous. The leaves had to be boiled in at least 2 changes of water, sometimes 3, to draw out the toxins. After that, the cooked greens were drained, squeezed dry, and fried in bacon grease with a little onion. It tasted something like spinach, only earthier and slightly bitter. Getting it wrong meant cramps, vomiting, or worse. Getting it right meant a free plate of greens that grew wild within walking distance of any still site in the southern mountains. Some families fried an egg on top of the cooked poke and called it supper. Number 23. Leather breeches. Green beans did not last long in the summer heat, and moonshiners who worked remote sites needed food that would keep for months. The solution was leather breeches. Whole green beans were threaded onto a long string using a needle, then hung from the rafters of a cabin or strung between trees near the still to dry in the open air. After a few weeks, the beans shriveled into hard, leathery strips that could be stored in a cloth sack all winter. When it was time to eat, they were soaked overnight in water and then simmered for hours with a piece of salt pork. They rehydrated into something tender and deeply flavored, nothing like a fresh green bean, but satisfying in a way that only slow-cooked preserved food can be. Number 22. Ramp scramble. Ramps are wild leeks that grow in dense patches across the shaded coves of Appalachia, usually appearing in early spring before the trees fully leaf out. They smell like a cross between garlic and onion, only sharper. Moonshiners dug them up by the handful, sliced the bulbs and leaves together, and fried them in lard or bacon fat with whatever eggs they had. The smell carried far enough through the woods that some old-timers joked it could give away a still site faster than the smoke. The taste was intense, almost burning on the tongue when raw, but mellowed into something rich and savory once cooked with eggs. Ramps were free, abundant, and grew exactly where moonshiners worked. Today they are considered a delicacy at farmers' markets, but back then they were just another weed that kept a man fed in the woods. Number 21. Squirrel gravy over biscuits. Gray squirrels were everywhere in the hardwood forests of Appalachia, and they were one of the easiest animals to hunt quietly near a still site. A moonshiner skinned and jointed the squirrel. browned the pieces in a cast iron skillet, then slow-simmered them in water until the meat fell off the bone. The drippings became gravy, thickened with a spoonful of flour and seasoned with black pepper. That gravy went over biscuits baked in the same skillet, split open and laid flat so the gravy soaked into every layer. The meat was pulled off the bones and stirred back into the gravy so nothing went uneaten. It was simple, filling, and required almost nothing that had to be bought or carried in. A good shot with a rifle could put a squirrel in the skillet before the sun cleared the ridge. One squirrel fed one man for a full meal, and in a forest full of oaks and hickories, there was never a shortage of squirrels. Number 20. Branch lettuce. Branch lettuce was the mountain name for wild watercress, a small green plant that grew in cold, shallow streams all through the Appalachian highlands. Moonshiners picked it right out of the creek beside the still, rinsed it, and ate it raw or wilted it with hot grease. It had a sharp, peppery bite that cut through the heaviness of pork and corn. It was also one of the few sources of fresh vitamins available during the winter months because watercress stayed green even when snow covered the ground. No planting, no tending, no harvesting season. A man could step 10 feet from his still, reach into the creek, and come back with a handful of greens. It grew where the water ran clean, and in moonshine country, the water almost always ran clean. Number 19. Cornmeal mush with sorghum. This was the meal that kept more mountain families alive through hard winters than almost anything else on this list. Cornmeal was stirred slowly into boiling water in a heavy pot, just a handful at a time, until the mixture thickened into a smooth, porridge-like mass. It was bland on its own, almost tasteless, but that was the point. It was a vehicle for whatever sweetness a family could get. In moonshine country, that sweetness was almost always sorghum. Sorghum was made from the juice of sorghum cane, pressed through a hand mill, and boiled down in a long, shallow pan over a wood fire until it reduced into a thick, dark, amber syrup. The process took hours. Someone had to stand at the pan and skim the green foam off the top as it boiled, adjusting the fire to keep the temperature steady. Too hot, and the syrup scorched. Too cool, and it never thickened. Every hollow in Appalachia had at least one family that made it, and during the fall, the smell of boiling sorghum hung in the air like a season of its own. The finished syrup was poured into jars and stored in a root cellar, and a single gallon could sweeten a family's food for months. A moonshiner working a night run might eat nothing but a bowl of mush with a long pour of sorghum and consider it a full supper. Children ate it for breakfast with a splash of buttermilk. Old men ate it when their teeth were gone and they could not chew meat anymore. Some families fried leftover mush in slabs the next morning, letting the outside crisp up in bacon grease while the inside stayed soft. It was the cheapest possible meal, the simplest possible cooking, and it sustained entire communities for generations. When the last sorghum mills in the region closed down in the second half of the 20th century, this dish quietly vanished from most tables. Number 18. Crackling bread. When a hog was slaughtered, every part was used. The skin was cut into small pieces and rendered in a pot until the fat melted away and the skin crisped into hard, golden nuggets called cracklings. Those cracklings were stirred directly into cornbread batter and baked. The result was cornbread with pockets of crunchy, salty pork fat throughout. It was heavier and greasier than regular cornbread, and it kept longer too, because the rendered fat acted as a preservative. At a still sight, a man could wrap a chunk of crackling bread in a cloth, carry it in his coat pocket, and eat it cold hours later. The cracklings gave it enough salt and fat to keep a working man satisfied between real meals. Some cooks added a chopped onion to the batter, which browned during baking, and gave the bread another layer of flavor. Number 17. Sowbelly and half-runner beans. Sowbelly was the mountain term for salt-cured pork belly, the fattiest, cheapest cut from the hog. Half-runners were a regional variety of green bean that grew well in the thin, rocky soil of Appalachian gardens. The two were cooked together in one pot for hours, the salt pork flavoring the beans and the beans stretching the meat into something that fed a whole crew. The broth at the bottom of the pot was almost as valuable as the food itself, soaked up with cornbread or drunk straight from a tin cup. This was a still site staple, cooked in a single pot over the same fire that heated the still. The longer it simmered, the better it got, and nobody was in a hurry at a still site where a run of whiskey took all day. Number 16. Speckled trout fried in lard. The cold mountain streams of Appalachia were full of brook trout, and catching them required nothing more than a hook, a line, and a cricket. Moonshiners pulled them out of the same creeks they used to cool their worm condensers. The fish were small, rarely more than 8 or 9 inches long, gutted on the spot, rolled in cornmeal, and fried whole in a skillet of hot lard. The skin crisped up and the bones were soft enough to eat. 2 or 3 trout made a meal. There was no seasoning beyond salt and the cornmeal crust. The flavor came from the cold water and the clean fat, and men who ate them at dawn beside a still remembered that taste for the rest of their lives. Number 15. Killed lettuce. The name sounds violent, and in a way, it was. Leaf lettuce or wild greens were picked fresh and piled into a bowl. Then a skillet of bacon grease was heated until it was nearly smoking. A splash of vinegar was added, and the whole sizzling mixture was poured directly over the raw greens. The hot fat wilted the leaves instantly, cooking them on contact. The vinegar cut through the grease and gave the dish a sharp, tangy edge. It was eaten immediately, before the greens turned soggy. Some families added a sliced boiled egg on top or a few rings of raw onion. It was fast, cheap, and used whatever greens happened to be growing nearby. The whole thing came together in less time than it took to boil water. Number 14. Stack cake. This was the most remarkable dessert in Appalachian cooking, and it never required an oven in the way most cakes do. Stack cake was built in layers. Thin rounds of a stiff molasses-flavored dough were cooked one at a time in a cast-iron skillet, almost like pancakes, but denser and chewier. Between each layer went a thick spread of dried apple filling. The apples had been dried in the sun or over a fire during the fall, then rehydrated and cooked down with sorghum or brown sugar into a dark, spiced paste. A pinch of cinnamon or allspice went in if the family had any, but the filling worked without it. The natural sweetness of the dried apples concentrated during the drying process, so even without added sugar, the filling tasted richer than fresh applesauce. A finished stack cake could be 6, 7, even 8 layers tall. But here is what made it unusual. The cake was not ready to eat when it was assembled. It had to sit for 2 or 3 days, wrapped in cloth, while the moisture from the apple filling slowly soaked into the dry layers and softened them. By the 3rd day, the whole thing had melded together into something dense, moist, and deeply flavored, almost like a spice cake. You could not rush it. A stacked cake eaten too early was dry and crumbly. One left to sit the full 3 days was a different food entirely. In the mountains, stacked cakes were traditionally made for weddings. Each woman in the community baked 1 or 2 layers and brought them to the celebration, where the layers were stacked together. The more layers, the more the bride was loved. Moonshiners did not have weddings at their still sites, but they had the same ingredients and the same skillet, and stack cake traveled well in a saddlebag. A wrapped stack cake could last a week in cool weather and still taste good on the last day. Number 13. Groundhog roast. Woodchucks, or groundhogs, were plentiful in the fields and meadows bordering the mountain forests. They were not glamorous game, but they were fat, especially in late summer when they were fattening up before their winter hibernation. A moonshiner skinned the animal, removed the scent glands under the front legs carefully to avoid a musky flavor, and either roasted it whole over a fire or cut it into pieces and stewed it with wild onions and potatoes. The meat was dark, greasy, and rich, with a gamey flavor that divided opinion even among mountain families. Older mountain cooks insisted the trick was to parboil it first to pull out some of the fat before the final roasting. Others soaked the cleaned animal overnight in salt water to mellow the taste. Either way, a fat groundhog roasted slow over coals with root vegetables was a meal that stuck with a man through a long night of tending a still. Number 12. Pawpaw fruit. The pawpaw tree grew wild in the understory of Appalachian forests, producing a soft, oblong fruit with a custard-like interior that tasted like a blend of banana and mango. It ripened in September and October and fell to the ground when it was ready. The fruit could not be stored or shipped because it bruised almost instantly and rotted within a day or two of picking. That is why almost nobody outside the mountains ever tasted it. Moonshiners ate pawpaws raw, scooping the flesh out with a spoon or their fingers, spitting out the large brown seeds. Some mashed the pulp into cornbread batter for a sweeter bread. It was a luxury that cost nothing and lasted only a few weeks each year. Number 11. Pot liquor with cornbread. Pot liquor was the liquid left in the pot after greens, usually turnip greens or collards, had been simmered for hours with a ham hock or a piece of fatback. It was rich, salty, smoky, and packed with the nutrients that had cooked out of the greens. In the mountains, the greens were eaten first, but the pot liquor was considered just as valuable. It was ladled into a bowl and eaten like soup, with cornbread crumbled directly into it. A man could make a full meal out of nothing but the broth from a pot of greens and a piece of bread. Some drank it hot from a jar while working, the way another man might drink coffee. Nothing was wasted, not even the cooking water. Number 10. Chestnut bread. Before the chestnut blight swept through eastern North America in the early 20th century, American chestnut trees dominated the Appalachian forests. The nuts were gathered by the bushel every fall, roasted over coals, or ground into a coarse flour that was mixed with cornmeal to make a slightly sweet, nutty bread. Moonshiners and their families depended on chestnuts the way other Americans depended on wheat. The nuts were so plentiful that hogs were turned loose in the forest to fatten on them before slaughter. When the blight killed nearly every chestnut tree on the continent within a few decades, this bread disappeared entirely. The flour could not be bought because there were no chestnuts left to grind. Older mountain people who remembered the taste described it as something between wheat bread and cake, with a sweetness that came from the nut itself. Today, almost nobody alive has ever tasted it. Number 9. Rabbit and dumplings. Rabbits were trapped or shot year-round in the mountains, and they were one of the most reliable sources of lean meat available to a man running a still in remote territory. The rabbit was jointed and simmered in a pot of water with salt and whatever herbs grew nearby, often a handful of wild sage or a sprig of thyme. Once the broth was rolling, dumplings made from flour, lard, and a pinch of baking powder were dropped in by the spoonful. They puffed up and cooked in the steam, soaking up the flavor of the rabbit. The whole pot was ready in less than an hour, and it stretched one small rabbit into enough food for 2 or 3 men. If you think that meal was resourceful, wait until you see what they did with a single persimmon tree. Number 8. Red-eye gravy and cathead biscuits. Red-eye gravy was made by frying a slice of country ham in a skillet, then deglazing the pan with black coffee. The coffee hit the hot grease and sputtered, and the liquid reduced into a thin, dark, intensely salty and bitter sauce. The red eye in the name came from the small circle of fat that floated in the center of the gravy when it settled in the bowl. Cathead biscuits were hand-shaped rounds of biscuit dough, called catheads because they were roughly the size of a cat's head. They were baked in a skillet greased with lard, pulled apart while still hot, and soaked in the red-eye gravy. It was a breakfast that tasted like salt, smoke, and strong coffee all at once. Country ham was cured for months in a smokehouse, sometimes up to a year, so by the time it hit the skillet, the flavor was concentrated into something almost overpowering. The coffee and the gravy tamed it just enough. This was not a delicate meal. It was food built to carry a man through a hard morning of physical work on a cold mountainside. Number 7. Persimmon pudding. The American persimmon grew wild across the lower elevations of Appalachia, but it could not be eaten until after the first hard frost. Before that, the fruit was so astringent it puckered the mouth shut. A child who bit into an unripe persimmon learned that lesson exactly once. Moonshiners knew to wait. After a freeze, the small orange fruit turned soft, wrinkled, and intensely sweet. The pulp was pushed through a colander or a coarse sieve to remove the seeds and skin, then mixed with eggs, milk, flour, and a pour of sorghum or honey. The batter was poured into a greased cast-iron skillet and baked over coals until it set into a dense, custardy pudding, dark brown on top and almost sticky in the center. It was not like any pudding you would find in a box today. It was heavy, rich, and tasted like caramel and wild fruit and wood smoke all at once. Some families added a handful of black walnuts on top, cracked from shells they had gathered and dried earlier in the fall. Others stirred in a splash of fresh cream right before baking, which made the center even softer. The pudding was seasonal by nature. It could only be made for a few weeks each year, after the frost, but before the possums and deer ate every last fruit off the ground. Gathering enough persimmons for a single pudding meant walking the ridgelines and hollows with a bucket, picking fruit off the ground one by one. The trees were scattered, not planted in rows, and a good tree might be half a mile from the next one. In some hollows, a good persimmon pudding was traded for a jar of whiskey, and neither side felt cheated. Number 6. Raccoon baked with sweet potatoes. Raccoon was a common game animal in the Appalachian woods, hunted at night with dogs and a lantern. The animal was skinned, cleaned, parboiled to remove excess fat, and then baked in a roasting pan surrounded by quartered sweet potatoes. The fat from the raccoon rendered down during the long, slow bake and soaked into the potatoes, turning them golden and rich. The meat itself was dark and strong-flavored, closer to pork than anything else but wilder. It was a feast day meal in most mountain households, not an everyday dish, and it required more preparation than most still-site cooking. But on nights when a moonshiner came home with a fat raccoon, this was what his family cooked. The sweet potatoes soaked up the drippings and came out tasting almost candied. Number 5. Fried rhubarb pie. Rhubarb grew in kitchen gardens across Appalachia, and its tart, sour stalks were cooked down with sugar or sorghum into a thick filling. Mountain women made small hand pies by spooning the filling onto rounds of biscuit dough, folding them over, crimping the edges with a fork, and frying them in lard. The crust came out golden and flaky, the filling inside bubbling and hot. These pies were portable, durable, and could be wrapped in a cloth and sent with a man heading up the mountain to his still. Cold or hot, they held together and tasted the same. They were one of the few sweet foods a moonshiner carried into the woods with him. A fried pie in your pocket and a jar of water from the creek was enough to get through a long afternoon of watching a still. Number 4. Shucky beans and ham hock. Shucky beans were another name for shellied beans, dried in their pods and stored for winter. They were a cousin of leather breeches, but prepared differently. The whole pods were left to dry on the vine until they rattled, then pulled off and stored in cotton sacks. To cook them, the dried pods were boiled for hours with a smoked ham hock, the bone and fat slowly flavoring the broth while the beans softened into something tender and meaty. The dish took most of a day to cook properly, and it filled the cabin with a smell that mixed wood smoke, pork, and earth. It was winter food, cold weather food, the kind of meal that made a one-room cabin feel warm even when the wind cut through the cracks in the walls. By the time the beans were done, the ham hock had given up everything it had, and the bone came out clean. Number 3. Venison jerky. Deer were the largest and most valuable game animal in the Appalachian Mountains, and moonshiners who lived off the land for weeks at a time needed a way to preserve the meat. Venison was sliced thin along the grain, rubbed with salt and sometimes black pepper or a dusting of dried red pepper, and hung over a low, smoky fire for a day or more until it dried into tough, chewy strips. The jerky kept for weeks without spoiling and weighed almost nothing. A man could carry a pocketful into the woods and eat it without stopping to build a fire or make noise. It was survival food in the purest sense, made from an animal that was hunted illegally as often as legally in the mountains, and dried beside the same fire that heated the mash. Number 2. Sourwood honey on corn pone. Sourwood trees bloomed in midsummer across the high ridges of Appalachia, and the bees that worked their blossoms produced a honey unlike any other. It was light amber, almost buttery, with a faintly spicy, anise-like finish that set it apart from clover or wildflower honey. Mountain families kept bee gums, hollowed-out sections of black gum trees, as crude hives near their homes. The honey was spread thick over corn pone, a simple, unleavened cornbread baked in a skillet. The combination of the sweet, complex honey and the plain, grainy bread was one of the finest things the mountains produced. Sourwood honey was also one of the few mountain products that brought real cash money, and some moonshiners traded jars of it alongside their whiskey. Number 1. The Still Sight Stew. There was no recipe for this. There was never a recipe for this. Whatever a moonshiner had on hand went into the pot. A squirrel shot that morning, a handful of wild ramps pulled from the creek bank, a few potatoes carried up from the cabin, the last of the dried beans from a cloth sack. It all went into water in a cast-iron pot hung over the fire that was already burning to heat the still. The stew cooked all day while the whiskey ran, and every man at the site ate from the same pot with the same spoon. It tasted different every single time, depending on the season, the game, and what the garden had given up that week. But it was always hot, always filling, and always shared. Nobody ever wrote down how to make it. Nobody needed to. The fire was already lit, the pot was already there, and the mountain gave you what it gave you. That was enough. 25 meals cooked over open fires beside copper stills, deep in the hollers where the law rarely reached. These were not restaurant dishes or recipes from a cookbook. They were the food of men who fed themselves from the woods, the creek, and the garden while making a living the only way they knew how. If your family comes from these mountains, there is a good chance someone you knew ate at least one of these. Drop a comment and tell us which one. If you made it this far, hit subscribe and share this with someone who remembers what real mountain cooking tasted like. We will see you in the next one.